In this presentation, we're going to be talking about your manifold gauges. These are the gauges that technicians use in a refrigeration system or air conditioning to check on the pressures and temperatures at various points in the system. It's a measurement of system health. We also use them to do our recovery of refrigerant, our charging of refrigerant, our connections for our vacuum, and connections for anything we need to do within a refrigeration system. Your gauges look like this, okay? You have a compound gauge, you have a pressure gauge, or a high side pressure gauge. The compound gauge, as we will talk about, is a special gauge because it will do both pressure and vacuum. The high side gauge just does pressure. It's connected to a valve body that has two handles on it. The handle allows refrigerant to flow to the center tube. Refrigeration gauges read the operating pressures of the system in a pounds per square inch manner. The gauge set consists of a compound gauge and a high pressure gauge. The compound gauge will read vacuum as well as pressure. All the valves open a path from each outside hose to the port in the center. The gauges read the pressure from the hoses under each gauge without opening the valves. So make sure when you attach the valves, the gauges to a system, the valve handles on each side of the gauge are closed. Low pressure gauge reads the pressure through the whole low side of the compressor, from the metering device to the compressor. High pressure gauges read the pressures on the high side of the system, from the compressor to the metering device. The low side gauges, the reality is it reads the temperature of saturation in the evaporator as a pressure. This is the point where the liquid has changed to a gas. The high side gauge does the same thing, but on the condenser side. This is the point where the high pressure hot vapor turns back to a high pressure liquid. Now, we talk about pressures. There's a few different pressure measurements you need to be aware of. Atmospheric pressure is the pressure of the atmosphere's weight on the Earth. It is 14.7 psi at sea level, and this you absolutely need to know that number. Atmospheric pressure is 14.7 psi at sea level. Gauge pressure is the pressure on a substance not including the atmospheric pressure. Gauge pressure is what you read on a set of gauges that have been calibrated to 0 at atmospheric pressure. Absolute pressure is the total pressure on a substance or object, including gauge and atmospheric. Okay, now, so gauges we calibrate to 0, so they start at 0 at atmospheric pressure. But some of the reading you'll do talks about absolute pressure. When you're comparing gauge pressure to absolute pressure, if what they're telling you is absolute pressure, subtract 14.7. Vacuum is measured in inches of mercury, microns, or water column. Inches of mercury is what your low side gauge shows. Microns you'll see on an electronic set of gauges or a vacuum gauge that's digital. Water column is used for air pressures in ductwork. Now, once your gauges are connected, you've taken your readings, you have to be able to remove your gauges without losing refrigerant or without leaving too much refrigerant in your gauges. So there's a procedure for pumping down gauges. To remove the manifold gauges and put as much refrigerant back into the system as possible, you have to pump down your gauges. When you're using low loss fittings, remove the high side hose with the low loss fitting from the Schrader fitting on the system. When you're not using low loss fittings, backseat the liquid line service valve. Leave the high side hose in place. If there's a low pressure switch, you may have to jump out the switch to do this. Open the high side red manifold valve and allow refrigerant into the manifold. Open the low side blue manifold port and allow the system to slowly enter the system. When both gauges stabilize at a single PSI, shut the system down. Then remove the jumper if you used one. Backseat the low side service valve to seal that side of the system, and then you can remove the hose from the low side and the high side. Reinstall all caps on the ports and restart the system. Make sure the system starts properly and check and make sure that there's no leaks.